As a developmental book editor, one of the most common elements that I am discussing with writers I work with is the length of their novel, and if they should expand it or condense it. And I've even talked about novel length quite a few times on this channel in different contexts, so I know it's something that's often top of mind if you are working on a manuscript draft. You might be asking yourself, how do I know what the right length for my novel is? How do I know if it's too long or too short? So I'm going to give you some advice and some pieces of framework here in order to help you identify the perfect novel length. Now, admittedly, there is no one specific answer, but I'm going to give you some strategies and factors to consider whenever you are thinking about your novel length and if it perhaps should change. If you're working on a book, I do recommend subscribing to my channel. Every week I talk about an aspect of books or novel writing like this, or I talk about the publishing industry, so if any of that interests you, I'd love to have you around. So let's dive into the first factor that you should consider when thinking about the optimal length for your novel, and that is genre. Genre is probably the most important factor to consider when you are thinking about your novel's length, because there are benchmarks out there for every specific genre as to what the ideal length is, especially when it comes to books that have been traditionally published. So first, you'll want to think about the age range for your target audience. If you are writing a middle grade novel, they should typically be between 20,000 and 50,000 words. If you are writing YA, it should typically be between 40,000 and 80,000 words. And for adult novels, I find the ideal range to be between 60,000 and 90,000 words. When it comes to adult, let's dive a little bit deeper into the most common genres that fall under adult fiction. If we're talking about thrillers or women's fiction, what we also call beach reads or book club reads, those tend to fall on the shorter end of the spectrum. If we're talking about literary fiction, sci-fi, or fantasy, then it typically falls on the longer end of the spectrum and potentially goes over that 90,000 word count. Now, anything shorter than 60,000 words would be considered a novella rather than a full-length novel. So now you might be wondering, what if you have written in one of the genres that I just specified, but your novel falls out of the range that I gave? What should you do then? Do you need to overhaul the whole thing or give up your dreams for publishing? No. What I want you to do is consider the other two factors I am going to go over next. Now, if you're struggling to determine what your genre even is, then I recommend checking out my video where I talk about all the fiction genres, so you can start there and then come back to this video and figure out which range is really optimal for your book. So now that we understand the basic framework regarding how word count aligns with your genre, let's talk about the next factor that will go into the length of your novel, and that is your publishing goals. If you hope to get your book traditionally published by a major publishing house, then the word count is going to be significantly more important in that scenario than if you are self-publishing. That's because literary agents and publishers are going to expect that your book falls within the standard range for that genre, and if it doesn't, then you're going to have a conversation as to why your novel justifies that shorter or longer length. So keep in mind that when you query literary agents, you are typically going to put the word count in your query letter itself. And so if it falls outside of the typical range for the genre you describe, the literary agent is immediately going to register that, and it might be a little bit of a red flag to them. And that is just because if the novel does fall outside of the typical range, it is considered an outlier, and it is ultimately harder for the literary agent to sell a book that is significantly shorter or significantly longer than the standard range to a publishing house. Now, why does the publishing house care about the length? That's because the length of your manuscript actually has a direct correlation to the production cost of making the book physically. A significantly longer book is going to require more formatting work as well as just physically more pages. That will ultimately affect the price that the publisher can set for that book. They might have to price it higher than another similar book, which then affects their willingness to ultimately pay you as the author through the agent. If it goes on the other end of the spectrum too, maybe it is significantly shorter, then the publisher feels they have to set a lower price point and they worry that they can't make a profit on that book. So all of that is why it really is best, if at all possible, to stay within the designated word count range for your genre if you want to be traditionally published. That will ultimately increase your chances of getting a literary agent's representation, and then in turn increase the chances that the literary agent is able to successfully sell your book to a publishing house. So let's talk about the flip side. And if you are self-publishing, you truly have the freedom to publish whatever length you want. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should. Remember that you're most likely going to have the most success if your book follows the typical standards for whatever genre it is. For example, if you're writing a thriller and self-publishing, I would not recommend exceeding 200,000 words because readers of thrillers just likely aren't going to be expecting that long of a work, and they're likely not going to engage well with it. Also keep in mind that you, when you're self-publishing, just like I described that publishing houses do, should match the length to the price point that you are setting. Books that are significantly longer should be priced higher, and books that are novella length should be priced shorter, but keep in mind that that also will affect the readership and the audience that you are able to attract, because some people maybe won't want to put in the investment for a longer book. The final consideration when you are thinking about what the ideal length for your novel is comes back to the narrative structure of your story. Beyond the genre and publishing goals that you have for the book, there are two key elements of your story itself that will naturally help determine the length. The first is the time span that your novel covers. Is the novel taking place just over a single day, or is it taking place over the course of years? A longer time span might, but not necessarily and not in every case, but it might correlate to a longer word count. The second narrative element that you want to consider when it comes to length is the POVs that you are following in the novel. Are you following just one single protagonist's journey from beginning to end, or do you have 3 interlocking storylines? The latter might justify a longer word count. Now, depending on how you treat those narrative elements, they will ultimately require a different amount of space on the page that really is unique to your own storytelling approach. You'll ultimately want to find that Goldilocks balance in your novel's length that is neither too long nor too short, but is just right. And if you are really struggling to figure out if your novel is too long or too short, or you know it's too long but don't know what to cut, then I really recommend working with a professional editor, because they will definitely be able to identify if the novel's length feels right and provide you guidance on what you might do to correct it if not. I hope this helped you determine the optimal length for your novel, or at least some benchmarks for your genre that you can work toward. Let me know in the comments what genre your book is, what your word count is, and whether you feel it is the right word count or if you feel it is too long or too short. And if you are in the category of thinking your novel is too long, then check out my video on scenes to cut for your novel. I go through specific examples of scenes that can often be omitted from your manuscript draft in order to make a tighter narrative. And as always, if you found this content helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. It helps me know I'm talking about the right things and giving you helpful advice, and allows me to bring you new content every single week. Thanks so much for watching, and happy writing.